everyone, my name is Garvin, and today we're stepping away from Greek mythology to talk about a more historical topic. At the request of my ever-wise patrons, we're going to talk about Greek colonization today. We even got a book review on the topic, and there'll be a link to that in the description. Now, I am going to try and tie this back a little bit to Greek mythology, but we're mainly going to look at the reasons for colonization and the most common procedures of colonization, and we're going to be focusing on the pre-Alexander waves of colonization. That means we'll be looking at stuff that happened in the Bronze Age and the 8th to 6th century BC. Now, if we're starting in the Bronze Age, we got to talk about the Minoans and the Myceneans. These are both Bronze Age civilizations, with the Minoans developing on the island of Crete, and they would spread out throughout the Aegean. The Mycenaeans developed later on mainland Greece, and after the Minoan civilization collapsed, they would colonize Crete, the Aegean islands, and the coast of Asia Minor. The Minoans did heavily influence the development of the Mycenaeans, and both civilizations had ongoing contacts with other Bronze Age civilizations like the Hittites, the Egyptians, and so on. The Minoans collapsed before the Mycenaeans did, and the Mycenaeans did not survive the Bronze Age collapse. This is why we have to draw a line between them and the classical Greeks. Characters like Agamemnon, Achilles, Helen, and Clytemnestra, if they even existed, weren't classical Iron Age Greeks like the historical Socrates, Herodotus, or Xenophon. They're Bronze Age Mycenaeans, and they live in a world that's very different from the historical Greeks we know. Their society is one of a more rigid social order, with the upper class living in large, fortified urban palace centers, and the majority of their society living in scattered farming communities ruled from those centered. While the classical Greeks had a class system, in most cities, it wasn't as rigid. That's not to say that social mobility was high or even a universal ideal across Greek. Just ask the Helots about that. But you had a better chance of rising up the ranks in classical Athens than you did in Bronze Age Athens. Minoan colonizing efforts were mostly confined to the islands of the Aegean Sea, although there was at least one major establishment in Asia Minor. They functioned more as trading ports and trade posts because the Minoans were more of a trading power than a military expansionist one. The Mycenaeans, however, were more militant, and after a series of natural disasters brought the Minoans to their knees, the Mycenaeans would invade Crete and colonize it along with the other Aegean islands, reaching as far as Rhodes and even Cyprus. They would also settle on the coast of Asia Minor as well, and that brought them into conflict with the Hittites. At least one of those conflicts is believed to be the basis for the Trojan War and all the characters I've been talking about for the last 2 months or so. If you want to know more about that, I'm going to point you to the Lady of the Library here on YouTube. Has her work on it, is really worth a listen. There'll be a link in the description. What's really interesting is, despite their conflicts and wars, all the societies I've mentioned here were heavily dependent on a widespread trade network that spanned from the British Isles to Afghanistan and northern India, even further according to some recent evidence. This trade network was driven by a desire for tin. Now, they did trade other things, but the big driver here is tin, and this is because of bronze. As I'm sure most of you know, bronze is an alloy that requires tin and copper mainly. Tin is fairly rare, all things considered, so to maintain their technology, they needed a functioning, widespread trade network, and their colonies were meant to ensure their access to it. So, Mycenaean colonies were focusing on maintaining access to the sea and providing good harbors for ships. Although, like I mentioned, there was settlement on Asia Minor as well. When the trade routes fell apart, though, that was the beginning of the end. Across the Mediterranean world, urban centers were abandoned. The collapse was so complete that the Greeks basically had to reinvent their society, including their writing system. The classical Greeks had to reinvent writing, developing their alphabet from the Phoenician one. As you can imagine, with urban centers in mainland Greece emptying out, most of the colonies were abandoned as well, although some Mycenaeans chose to settle even further from Greece than their colonies. For example, the Philistines of biblical fame are thought to be linked to them. This is due to Philistine pottery basically being Mycenaean in design and creation. Another pillar supporting this theory was discovered through DNA testing, showing that Philistines had a genetic origin in southern Europe. I'll link that article in the description as well for you. After the collapse came a dark age. Now, I want to be clear, when historians call a period a dark age, they usually mean a period in which there are no surviving written records or so few written records that we have no real sources except archaeology and oral tradition to tell us what was going on. Most dark ages also feature collapse in urban living, with cities emptying out or just disappearing, and urban life just taking over, which makes sense if no one's writing anything. The cities aren't there to power that engine. This doesn't mean that dark ages were without advancement or culture, however. In just about every dark age, there's a shocking amount of technological prowess, artistic creation, and other such activities going on. This is true for the Greeks as well. And one important innovation they came up with: ironworking. Iron is vastly more common than tin and doesn't require you to go through a lengthy, sometimes dangerous process to create alloys like bronze. Once you can get a fire hot enough to melt and work iron, odds are pretty good you'll find a local supply of it around somewhere. The mainland Greeks had plenty of it, and they used it to make farm and crafting tools, parts for ships, and of course, armor and weapons. This led to the development of phalanx warfare, which undermined the military power of the noble class. This allowed for newly emerging or recovering city states to develop new political and social systems, which meant social upheaval. Meanwhile, iron farming tools lead to an increase in farming production and thus a population boom. Meanwhile, the societies of the Near East were also recovering and reaching out looking to rebuild trade networks. Egypt had survived the end of the Bronze Age remarkably intact compared to everyone else. There were Hittite successor states and the Assyrian Empire expanding. These societies had urban centers that had managed to hang on and could offer goods, services, and materials that the Greeks lacked and now found themselves hungry for. So, the combination of a population rapidly outgrowing the available farmland of admittedly rocky and mountainous Greece and the new expanding trade fed the need to find new lands and resources and to increase their access to trade goods and learn new skills and crafts. You can combine this with the inevitable consequences of emerging political and economic systems, which means factional conflicts within the Greek city states. When one side wins, that still means there's a lot of folks around that disagree. Now, I imagine some of you are asking, well, why not solve this with a good old fashioned bloodbath? But remember, this is a city state with only a couple thousand people living in it. So you're talking about killing your neighbors and family members, which, besides leading to awkward Sunday dinners when mom is harping at you about killing cousin Manny, only leads to more grudges and fights later. So, sending off the losers or would be rebels to found their own city is frankly a better option for almost everyone involved. We're running a little long here, so I'm going to break this up into another video. Next week, we'll look at the common procedure of how Greek colonies are set up. We'll also look at the different types of Greek colonies. Now, I do hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please consider liking, subscribing, or even just leaving a comment. You can also join my Everwise patrons for just $1 a month, which gives you a voice in upcoming video topics and selections. There's a link below to the review I did on the book about Greek colonization, Greeks Overseas by Professor John Boardman. Before I go, I would like to give a special thanks to my biggest patron supporter, Big Steve. Thanks for your support, Steve. I appreciate it. Until next week, folks, I hope you stay safe and keep reading.